Alright, well, welcome back, everyone. I am working with a brand new mic, so hopefully the audio is crystal clear. I might switch back and forth from the mic on the camera versus the new mic. We'll see how it goes. So, ShoeOnHead made a video about no maps and maps on Twitter, and this guy responded to her in protest because, it's on now. She attacked the pedophiles. And so his first argument, well, before I get into the first argument, I cut out anything showing Shoe because that's irrelevant. I'm on Shoe's side on this, so. But I feel like I've gotten to the point where I can debunk pedophiles' arguments in my sleep. It's not exactly what I wanted to become known as, but, hell, I'm good at it, so fuck it. And I've done a whole video series debunking pedophiles' stupid-ass claims. So before we get into it, I think I've already said that before, but anyway, before we get into it, this guy starts talking about, like, he had to ignore something going on at work to do this response to Shoe, which is like, no, you didn't, and he almost forgot how to upload a video, and it's like, well, dude, like, can you please figure out how to upload a fucking video beyond 720p? Because all of his videos are super teeny tiny and the audio is shit. I mean, just shit-tastic. And yeah, it's just shit. So let's have a look at his first argument now.
Oh, it's go time. Yes, MAP is the politically correct term for a minor attracted person. It includes pedophiles, hebophiles, and ephebophiles. Don't like political correctness? Me neither. I'll make you a deal. I'll let you call them whatever the hell you want as long as you respect them.
Okay, so apparently MAP and no MAP is the politically correct term for pedophiles, hebophiles, and he put another file in there that I'm not really familiar with, which is interesting. I'll have to do some research on that, find out exactly what that is. That almost sounds like I'm not sure, but already he's acknowledged that he knows what a hebophile is, and that's very important because it's going to come up later. So the main crux of his argument is that this is the politically correct term. Well, I don't know that there's a politically correct term for pedophiles. Like, I'm pretty sure that's just the clinical term for it, is that if you are a person who is attracted to minors, then you are a pedophile. So he says, don't really care for political correctness, that's okay. You can call them whatever the hell you want as long as you respect them. And I have to ask, respect in what sense? Do I have to respect them in the sense that I respect sociopathy? And sociopath is a real clinical illness. Go and fucking look it up. There's tons of psychologists, neurologists, criminologists that still use that term. It's still relevant. I'm not getting into the semantics of it. But so do I have to respect them in the sense of, like, there's sociopaths that don't go out there and keep their shit in check and make sure that they're doing everything in their will that's necessary, or anything that they can do possibly to refrain from acting upon and committing violence and atrocities on other people, such as rape, murder, cannibalism, and necrophilia. So, I mean, as long as you're not doing that, are we talking about respect in that sense, where it's like, wow, that's still a screwed up individual, but I'm really glad that they're keeping it under control. Because, I mean, I suppose I could see that with a pedophile. It's like, well, I mean, it's good that you admit that you're a pedophile and you're taking the necessary actions to be proactive in keeping yourself from going out and committing the act. That you realize that you as a pedophile are essentially saying that you could cause a great deal of harm to a child's psychology and you don't want to do that, so you're doing all the things necessary to make it so that you're not around children and you don't act on it. And acknowledging it as a mental illness, respect it in that sense, or respect them as in, you poor thing, you have a mental illness, you can't help it, because I'm not going to do that with either one. I'm not going to do it with sociopaths. I'm not going to do it with pedophiles. That's just the way it is. It's like, yes, sociopathy is a mental illness, and so is pedophilia, but when you act on the violence, when you act on the pedophilia, when you act on these things and it causes great amounts of damage to people and their psychology, their psychological health, I'm not going to say, oh, well, it's not their fault. You just don't understand. They have a disorder. If that's the type of respect you're looking for, no, that's not going to happen, and I don't think that should ever happen. We're not just going to do that. You cannot molest a child. You just can't. It's not okay. Not in any... No. Just no. Let's go on to the next argument.
What is to be done is always the best part of these hate videos. Too bad Shue didn't go on as long as most while venting her learned hatred. She covered the highlights, though. Then it was on to a different kind of ignorance. See, one definition of ignorance might be having a negative prejudice against another culture. That was a given. But then there's just good old-fashioned having the facts wrong. Like claiming Jews did 9/11, we have both here at once. Pedophilia was a part of the movement to respect other people's sexualities from the beginning. As I covered in a previous video, pedophiles were only thrown under the bus by other queers in recent decades to accelerate their acceptance.
Alright, so that last argument about the whole, well, the pedophiles were part of the whole movement of acceptance of other sexualities, and other queers threw them under the bus to accelerate their civil liberties movement. Well, that sounds like somebody who used to belong to NAMBLA. That sounds exactly like somebody who used to belong to NAMBLA. No, that's not the case. Having sex with children is very distinctly differentiated between homosexuality. Even like reading homosexual like books written by homosexuals from times when even like Lord Byron, he doesn't talk about hanging out with a bunch of pedophiles. This is just not true. I don't know where he gets this information, but it's just not true. See, I mean, you have to take into account in this is like that there's so much that's being ignored in that one statement, like social psychology and evolutionary psychology. Just no. Two consenting adults being the same gender, and you want to compare that to I am an adult and this is a kid. That almost made me throw up in my mouth just saying that. That's all fucked up. No, that's not part... That you were pushed out of the movement because you didn't belong there in the first place. You are trying to say that your actual clinical disorder, because what you do hurts people, it destroys the psychology of innocent children. You can't compare that to homosexuality. You can't. It's not the same fucking thing. I think it's hilarious when they do. There's a lot I could say on that. Let's move on to the next argument.
Yeah, preying on people's empathy and tolerance, because that's what's going on here. Let me help you with some of that empathizing part. Put yourself in the place of a map. When you look around you, you don't see empathy and tolerance. You see Nazis. You see yourself surrounded by a swell of hatred so strong it won't be understood by many who haven't faced it directly. Oh, and as I've said before, of course pedophilia is a sexual orientation. It's how these people are oriented sexually. That's what you call the phenomenon.
So pedophiles are the only ones that I've ever seen that actually say that pedophilia is a sexuality, a sexual orientation. It is true, psychologically speaking, that there's nothing that we know of that can do anything about it. Although there's some other interesting psychological things about pedophilia. For instance, generally speaking, pedophiles don't necessarily partake in a preference to a gender. And a lot of this can boil down to actually sociopathy, but it's the need or desire to want to dominate something or somebody weaker than themselves. This is why it's also not shocking to find that many pedophiles are into other things like BDSM, ABDL, which is adult baby diaper lover, or things like being a zoophile, or being into necromancy, or being into rape fetishes. And if you look at criminal psychology, that's where it even gets into the worst of the worst, is when they engage in this sort of addictive behavior where they might engage into things like child pornography, and then the pornography becomes not enough, and then they seek the actual act out itself. This is not the case for homosexuals. This is not the same thing. We don't see the same pattern psychologically. We see a very different pattern and a very different approach to sexuality. Ultimately, the desire to want to dominate something weaker than yourself is not a sexual act in and of itself. It's an act of violence. And in fact, in pedophiles that we do chemically castrate, they find other means to do things to their victims. So this isn't about sex. It's about dominancy. Whereas two men or two women who have sex with each other, that is about sharing intimacy and love. It's basically mimicking the action of copulation, the best that two females or two males can. And that's something that heterosexual people do. It's like, I like you, you like me, we're going to go through the motions of making a baby. The only difference is that homosexuals won't actually produce a baby. So no, I understand what he's saying, that it's a world full of Nazis to him, but that's because it goes back again to the whole, like, the comparison that I'm making between sociopaths. It's like, if a sociopath is doing everything in their power to not act upon their behavior, that's great. That still doesn't make them not a sociopath and something to be concerned about. Just because you're a pedophile and you're not acting on it doesn't mean you are still not anything to worry about. You are. Because that temptation or that desire to want to control something weaker than you is still there, and maybe you take it out in a healthy way via BDSM, ABDL, which I would consider a healthier alternative. If you don't stay on that line and you actually do go out and commit the act, or even watch recordings of the act, that's a childhood gone. That is psychological damage that can never be repaired. So let's go on to the next argument that this person makes.
No, it's what a person finds sexually and or romantically attractive. It's not any more complicated than that. Think children can't consent? Ask your great-grandparents what they were doing when they were 12 or 13. You're all kinds of mistaken if you think waiting until 18 is natural or healthy. I could more credibly claim that in recent years it's adult women who've forgotten how consent works. If you're confused about the workings of the relationships, whether or not they can last, whether or not they're symbiotic, etc., please just ask your current or previous boyfriends. After that, it's a few minutes of shaming individuals for their sexuality.
Alright, so this is where the topic of hebephilia is going to come up again, is because he's making a proclamation that children do consent. And he starts talking about roughly between the ages of 12 to 18. And he is correct. The majority of the population does not wait until they're 18 years of age to have a sexual relationship. That's absolutely correct. But the thing is most people choose to do that within, their kind of age bracket. Now, you might be able to make a case in the upper teen years, like maybe between the ages to 16 to 18, that kind of starts slipping a little bit, and you start getting like 17-year-olds might date like 22, 23-year-olds. Absolutely, that does happen, but we're still talking about post-pubescent, which is a big difference. And we're also negating the very important evolutionary psychology. Now, if we go back hundreds of years ago, back to the Greek and the Roman Empire, which is something that the pedophiles love to bring up, is the fact that 15-year-olds were having sexual relationships with older men back in that time frame. Well, what was an older man in that time frame could have been like 25. And at 15 back then, you were considered to be a grown adult in that time frame. You were expected to have a family. You were expected to be able to grow your crops and to support your family. And they might take on being a mentorship. And so they would have a mentor. And they might engage in sexual activities between this 15-year-old and the person who's mentoring them. But pretty much by the time you were 30, you'd be lucky to live till 40. And if you made it, not very many people made it up into their 60s, really. Life expectancy was very, very low. Now, moving forward, how we treat teenagers now is very, very different. The psychological placement of a 15-year-old now is very, very different than the psychological placement of a 15-year-old from the Greek and Roman Empire. They are not expected to have a family. They are not anywhere near expected to take care of themselves. This is what brings up the point of what is called statutory rape. There is a reason that was invented, that sort of phrasing, terminology came into being, is that, yes, while the person is sexually mature, knows what sex is, wants to have sex, and actually even seeks it out, an adult who is much smarter, has a fully developed frontal lobe, has the ability to manipulate this person into thinking that they are in love, that they are committed, and they're not fully aware of the full capability of how an adult can manipulate a person that young into doing things that they don't necessarily want to do, and distorting their reality via lying and manipulation to get what they want out of that person. That is why we call it statutory rape, is that yes, they are knowingly consenting to sex, but they're not knowingly consenting in the sense that they don't know how manipulative an adult can be towards somebody who is 15, who is very, very naive. And if you do not believe the naivety of somebody who is in the age brackets between 15 to even, I'd go as far as to say 24, looking at the psychological difference between somebody in the age bracket between 15 to 17 is going to be very, very different to looking at the psychological or maturity or psychological status of somebody people who are between the ages of 17 to 24, and yet alone the psychology is going to be very, very different of that age bracket compared to 24 to 30. These are all very different. So we're talking about hebephilia, not pedophilia anymore. And no, children cannot consent. And even if they did say yes, they have no idea what they're saying yes to. Children do not know what sex is. That is prepubescent. Postpubescent is hebephilia. So let's not mix this up anymore. Teenagers can consent to sex, although they should not consent to sex with a grown adult. They don't know what they're getting into, and the emotional and mental maturity levels are so vastly different. It's not really a compatible or really a wise decision to do on behalf of the teenager. And for the adult that thinks that they are emotionally, romantically, and psychologically compatible with somebody who's in the hebephilic bracket of, let's say, we're talking pre or post-pubescent at this point, so between the ages of 15 to all the way to 18, let's say. If you think that, let's say, a 30-year-old is psychologically compatible with that age bracket, then I would have to wonder about the ineptitude of the person who is 30 years old. If you can emotionally identify with somebody who is 16 years old at 30, you might be you might just fucking be retarded, to be honest. Mentally retarded. Let's move on to the next argument.
Now, I fucking hate kids. I'm a loud anti-natalist. You're destroying my planet to make another copy of your selfish genes. Stop.
Alright, so that last one probably didn't make a whole lot of sense because I cut Shue's bit out of it where she says, keep fighting the good fight. But I don't know what he's rambling on about this, that he's an anti-prenatalist and all this shit about you're making the world or the worst place for your genes, blah, 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 blah. I don't know what all that nonsense, that garbage was. That just sounded like irritation and just responding to it like, I think he feels defeated, and so he's just saying that out of spite. But I do have to say that for some reason there is a phenomenon where there are people who are not pedophiles that are supporting pedophiles. And that to me is very, very bizarre. I would think that anybody in this world who has ever been a parent would never stand behind pedophilia ever. Especially anyone who has had a child or who they themselves have been molested as a child. I have had so many people reach out to me after making my anti-pedophile series that I had back when Omnipolitics 16 was a thing, and Jen. I guess Jen's still around, but she hasn't made a video in I don't know how long. So, no, oddly, there are people that support pedophiles, but I think it's that kind of argument to emotive force of, I'm a victim, poor me, feel bad for me, and all that sort of emotional blackmail. And it's like, well, yes, it is a mental condition. It is recognized by the psychological community as a mental dysfunction. It is a mental disorder. And the reason there's actually, this is very interesting, and I know this, even if we look at bonobo apes, our closest living relatives, they do not engage in pedophilia. The most that you're going to find is that sometimes the young ones will mimic coitus, but they will not actually partake in it. This is the bonobo apes that do this. But in the animal kingdom, they do not try to mate with other animals. Like just pick a species. They will not try to mate with another that is prepubescent. They're not even interested until they are capable of rearing offspring. And you have to keep in mind there's only a handful of species that have sex for pleasure. Most other species will only have sex to reproduce. The human species is one of the few species that will have sex for pleasure. But even when we do look at the other species that does have sex for pleasure, they still do not engage in pedophilia. This is something that only exists in the human species, unless you get down to prokaryotes or something like that, or amoebas. But you're talking about a lifespan of possibly like a day or two. And so I don't think we're comparable in that sense. We have an evolutionary psychology. So the psychological makeup of a prepubescent child is going to be very, very different than an adolescent child, and is going to be very different to a teenage person. And even the psychological makeup of somebody who's in their early 20s is going to be vastly different than the psychological makeup of somebody who's after the age of 25. Because the frontal lobe and cerebral cortex do not fully develop until after the age of 25. So, I don't see how pedophiles... by the way, this guy does make this is his regular fucking content. Everything this guy makes, not everything, most of what's on his channel, the few videos that he does, is all about pedophilia. And I don't advocate for going to his channel and saying, like, go kill yourself and you suck and fuck you. And I understand the urge and the desire to want to. I understand the anger and the frustration. I just don't think that it will actually do any good. I think it does more harm than it does good. I think when he's met with people who come forward, and it would be really great to have somebody who is a psychologist go through these arguments and actually talk about the full-fledged psychological mapping of pedophilia, and talk about why this is considered a mental disorder and not a sexual orientation. We do find homosexuality within the animal kingdom, even amongst species that only reproduce, that only have sex to reproduce, that we still find homosexuality. But we do not find pedophilia. This to me is probably one of the most important things in differentiating, or the biggest thing that differentiates pedophilia from homosexuality and being a sexuality or a sexual orientation, is that it does not exist in the animal kingdom. I used to breed and raise guinea pigs. They won't even do it. A fucking rodent this big they'll engage they will engage in incest. Guinea pigs will do that. But what they will not do is engage in pedophilia. The male will not try to mate with a female that is not capable of rearing an offspring. They will not do it. And male guinea pigs are horny little motherfuckers. You just plop a female in there. They generally rape the female, but that's very common amongst the rodent species. Well, rodents isn't a species. That's like a kingdom class Guinness? Don't remember. I don't remember that aspect from environmental science. We went over it so many times, I just don't remember it. It's not come up since. But you get my point. Most rodents, like I believe it's common in rats, mice, rabbits, gerbils, hamsters. The male actually does have to. The female's never going to be in heat. The males just kind of rape the females. But the point is that when something doesn't exist in the animal kingdom, and you want to call that a sexuality, and then we find something that does exist in the animal kingdom, and that is a sexuality, and it's accepted because there's no actual victim as well. But when we talk about pedophilia, there is a victim. And this is something that you could, I mean, there's so much more that you can go into in this, as far as evolutionary psychology goes, the different psychological states of different age brackets. These are all aspects that are taken into account in assessing what these pedophiles are talking about. And nowhere can we find an acceptable kind of layover where it's like, well, it's okay in this instance. The best you're going to get is that, yes, it is true that back in the day, 17-year-old females would engage in marriage with 22-year-old men, possibly even up into their 30s. That's just not something that we do anymore, and we listen to females more often because youth is sort of a symbol of fertility. So, I mean, you know, when I was young, looking at a 30-year-old, I thought, ew, gross, that's disgusting. Now that I'm 30, I find people who are 40, look at them and I go, wow, they're really hot and they're attractive. That's something that was completely beyond my mindscape when I was 17. Looking at a 30-year-old, I thought that was disgusting. That's too old. That's gross. Ew. No. What makes you think females would be any different? And that's the thing, is that psychologically, we evolve. We didn't just evolve to be the creature that we are today through intelligence. We also psychologically evolve. And that's something that is still continuing on today. So, I'll leave you with that thought. Fuck this asshole. I hate him, and I think ShoeOnHead has been in the bit and doing YouTube videos long enough that this will be like water off of a duck's back to her. But to Shoe, I'd really like to thank her for being another voice, and she has 1 million subscribers, to be able to reach out and proactively talk about this. That no, pedophilia is not a sexual orientation. They are not attaching themselves to the LGBT community. Not happening. Okay? There is a huge psychological difference between an adult, a teenager, an adolescent, and then, of course, a child. Each one of those groups has a very, very different psychological mind frame. And when you engage in a sexual activity, even hebephilia, let's say a 30-year-old, having a sexual relationship or even trying to have a platonic relationship, a romantic relationship with a 15-year-old can be psychologically damaging and traumatizing, and they lack, the 15-year-old will lack the independency and the skills and know-how to get themselves out of a situation that could be potentially abusive. I hope I cannot make that any more fucking clearer. This is abuse. There is a victim. When I was 17 and I had a boyfriend that was roughly around the same age, he might have been 16, but that was purely consensual. I wasn't having sex with people in their latent 20s. That didn't happen till later, when I turned 18. And even then, I had the wits to me at 18 years old to know that I couldn't carry a relationship with somebody who's old enough to be my father. This happened when I was 18, okay? It was completely legal. I was 18 years old. I had sex with somebody who was old enough to be my father. And he wanted to be my boyfriend, and I said no. There's a generational gap between the two of us that will never be mended. You talk about things that happened when you were in your 20s because you remember them. I only know about them because I've read about them through books and seen things about them in documentaries. I don't remember it. I wasn't there. So I said, no, this is purely sex. End of story. That happened to me when I was 18. That's a true story. And I questioned the mental integrity of said person. I thought he might be a little slow, thinking that he could carry on a romantic relationship with somebody who was 18 years old. And it was I, the 18-year-old, that drew the line. But his proclamations are complete bullshit. Most women who were young, who got married to older men, was done so out of force, and it was also done for money, financial stability. We are done with these archaic, puritanical, Christo-fascist agenda ways. We're done with them. They're over. It's not happening anymore. Women can choose. And I would choose not to be with somebody that much older than me. That would just be my choice. But it is true, yeah. My mom, she was 17. She married my dad. He was 22. And they did so with parents' consent. You have to have parents' consent to do that. That's still enacted today. But that's not pedophilia. And you could only vaguely call it hebephilia. Only vaguely. But the age bracket, the age difference that you look at, the psychological difference between a 17 and a 22-year-old is not really that much. The psychological difference between a 17-year-old and a 30-year-old is vast. So fuck this guy. Fuck him. Fuck his arguments. He's full of shit. He's completely ignoring a lot of psychological studies. He's ignoring the difference between pedophiles and hebephilia, and even in the beginning admitted to knowing that these things existed. So that's just intellectually dishonest. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell button on any channel you're subscribed to. If you really want to see this guy's stupid fucking channel, I'll leave the link to it in the description below. I hope you don't harass him. And I hope he gets professional help from a clinical psychologist. And with that, I'm out.